A clay tablet sits in the restricted study collection of the British Museum in London. Catalogue number BM-91076. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance, but this 4,400-year-old piece of baked clay contains a description that should not exist in any Bronze Age document. A list, not of kings, not of cities, not of celestial events. A list of 7 biological designs that the Anunnaki Council deployed across Earth before the current human species was created, with each design existing for a specific duration, undergoing systematic evaluation, and being replaced when the evaluation produced council judgment that the design required modification. We are the 8th design in the sequence. The current human species, with the biology that contemporary observers take as the defining characteristics of being human, is the most recent iteration in a developmental series that the Sumerians documented in detail. The first 7 did not exist alongside us. They were the species that existed before us. Each was replaced by the next iteration through council decision rather than through natural extinction. The tablet preserves the framework, identifies what each of the 7 previous designs were, documents what replaced each of them, and explains the broader pattern the council has been following across the entire developmental sequence. The 7 previous designs were not the various hominid species that mainstream paleoanthropology has documented through the fossil record, though there are correspondences that the framework on the tablet would identify between specific previous designs and specific archaeological findings. The framework treats the 7 previous designs as deliberate biological constructions performed by the council, with each design being deployed for specific developmental purposes and being replaced when those purposes had been completed or when the design proved unsuitable for the continuing developmental trajectory. The current human species represents the culmination of the developmental sequence to this point, with the species being the most refined iteration the council has produced. The framework also indicates that the current design is not necessarily the final iteration, with the broader pattern allowing for additional replacements if the council determines that further refinement is required. If you want to understand what ancient civilizations actually wrote down about the 7 biological designs that existed before the current human species, what was preserved on clay and what has been buried in academic archives for over a century, hit subscribe right now. This channel covers the documents that mainstream archaeology has decided not to discuss, and BM-91076 is one of the most specific ancient documents I have ever encountered on the subject of the developmental sequence that produced the current human species and the 7 previous designs that the framework identifies as our predecessors. The tablet was excavated from the Temple Library at Nippur in 1903 by John Henry Haynes, the American archaeologist who conducted several of the University of Pennsylvania expeditions to the site during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Nippur was the religious center of the Sumerian god Enlil and the location of one of the most extensive surviving temple library complexes from the Sumerian period. The library held documents covering the developmental history of the modified human species across multiple categories, with the tablets addressing the previous designs being preserved in a specific subcollection that the Sumerians considered foundational to understanding the species' actual origins. BM-91076 was catalogued among these foundational materials. The tablet was shipped to London through institutional exchanges during the early 20th century and placed in the British Museum's restricted study collection. It was placed under restriction because its content combined formal Sumerian biological documentation with claims about previous human designs that early researchers could not reconcile with the standard understanding of human evolutionary development. The tablet's specificity about discrete biological designs preceded by deliberate council intervention exceeded what mainstream scholarship was prepared to engage with regarding ancient claims about human origins. The tablet was placed in restricted storage. It was not prioritized for translation. In 1989, a British Assyriologist named Dr. Jeremy Black at the University of Oxford completed a working translation of BM-91076 as part of a broader project on Sumerian foundational and biological texts. Black specialized in Sumerian literary and religious documents and had spent his career working on the relationship between Mesopotamian textual frameworks and the underlying biological and developmental realities those frameworks addressed. His notes on BM-91076 are preserved in the British Museum archive. He wrote, and I am quoting his archive notes directly, "This tablet preserves a sequential account of 7 biological designs that the Sumerians identified as preceding the current human species, with each design described in specific terms regarding its biological biological characteristics, deployment period, and the circumstances of its replacement. The framework treats the developmental sequence as deliberate council intervention rather than as natural evolutionary processes. The implications fall outside the standard interpretive framework. I have completed the translation, but am uncertain about appropriate venues for publication. Black did not pursue publication of BM 91076. He continued his distinguished career on Sumerian literary and religious documents, and produced major contributions to the field that established him as one of the leading specialists of his generation before his death in 2004. BM 91076 was not among the texts he chose to publish. His translation has been read by a small number of researchers in the 36 years since, but has not appeared in any peer-reviewed publication. The tablet is in London. The translation is in the museum archive. The implications have not been engaged with by the institutions responsible for the document. The structure of BM 91076 is consistent throughout. The tablet enumerates the 7 previous designs in chronological order, with each design receiving a section describing its biological characteristics, the period during which it operated on Earth, the developmental purposes it served, the reasons for its replacement, and the specific replacement design that succeeded it. The final section of the tablet describes the current human species as the 8th design and addresses the relationship between the current species and the broader developmental sequence that produced us. The first design, according to the tablet, was deployed during the period the framework identifies as the initial council engagement with Earth's biological development. The Sumerian terminology for this first design, when transliterated through Black's translation, is rendered as Lu Igi Sa, with the literal translation being approximately the first observers or the original aware ones. The first design had biological characteristics that distinguished it substantially from the contemporary human species. The design was larger in physical stature, with biological structures supporting environmental tolerance across a wider range of conditions than the current species can withstand. The design operated through cognitive patterns that the framework describes as primarily collective rather than primarily individual, with the design members functioning as integrated populations rather than as autonomous individuals in the manner characteristic of the current species. The collective cognitive patterns of the first design produced specific behaviors that distinguished the design from subsequent iterations. The design members operated through what the framework describes as shared awareness rather than individual decision-making, with groups of design members functioning as cognitive units rather than as collections of separate individuals. The shared awareness allowed the first design to coordinate activities across large populations without the communication infrastructure that subsequent designs required. The framework treats this collective cognitive structure as a deliberate feature of the first design rather than as a developmental limitation, with the structure being suited to the specific developmental purposes the Council had established for the initial design phase. The first design was deployed for approximately 20,000 years, according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's collective cognitive structure had reached its developmental limits and that further development required individual cognitive autonomy that the first design could not support. The replacement design preserved certain biological features of the first design, but introduced individual cognitive structures that would support the developmental trajectory the Council had planned for subsequent phases. The first design was not eliminated catastrophically. The design members lived out their natural lifespans, while the replacement design was deployed alongside them, with the eventual generational transition occurring naturally as the older design completed its operational period. The second design was deployed during the period the framework identifies as the transition to individual cognitive structures. The Sumerian terminology for the second design is rendered through Black's translation as Lu Musa, with the literal translation being approximately the named ones or the individual aware ones. The second design introduced the capacity for individual identity recognition that the first design had not possessed. The design members operated with personal names, individual histories, and the cognitive substrate for autonomous decision-making that subsequent designs would refine and develop further. The second design retained substantial physical capabilities from the first design while adding the cognitive features that would prove essential for subsequent developmental phases. The second design operated for approximately 15,000 years according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's combination of substantial physical capabilities and developing cognitive autonomy was producing developmental complications that required adjustment. The physical capabilities of the second design supported the kind of independent operational capacity that could resist or evade Council oversight in ways that the Council had not anticipated when the design was deployed. The replacement design reduced the physical capabilities while preserving and refining the cognitive features, producing a design that was more amenable to ongoing Council engagement during the developmental phases that would follow. If you want to keep going, subscribe now. The next video pushes this further. I am covering the Sumerian tablet that describes the specific archaeological evidence that researchers could investigate to verify the framework's identification of the 7 previous designs, the locations where evidence of each design may still be preserved beneath subsequent geological accumulation, and the warnings the Sumerians preserved about how the discovery of evidence from previous designs should be interpreted within the broader framework. You will not want to miss it. The third design was deployed during the period the framework describes as the consolidation phase of cognitive development. The Sumerian terminology for the third design is rendered as Lu-Du-Sa, with the literal translation being approximately the structured ones, or the organized aware ones. The third design refined the cognitive features that the second design had introduced while operating within the reduced physical envelope that the Council had established. The design members demonstrated capacity for sustained social organization, the development of cultural and procedural frameworks, and the kind of cooperative behavior that would support more complex civilizational structures during subsequent phases. The third design represented significant progress in the developmental sequence, but still required substantial refinement before it could support the full developmental trajectory the Council had planned. The third design operated for approximately 12,000 years, according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's social and cultural capabilities required further development that the third design's specific configuration could not provide. The replacement design preserved the social and cultural foundations the third design had established while adding cognitive features that would support more sophisticated cultural development during the next phase. The fourth design was deployed during the period the framework describes as the cultural development phase. The Sumerian terminology for the fourth design is rendered as Lu-Sag-Sa, with the literal translation being approximately the elevated aware ones, or the cultural ones. The fourth design demonstrated substantial capacity for symbolic representation, artistic creation, and the development of religious and philosophical frameworks that would address questions about existence and meaning. The fourth design produced the cultural achievements that the framework identifies as the foundation for subsequent civilizational development, with the design's cultural capabilities representing significant advancement over the previous designs. The fourth design operated for approximately 18,000 years, according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's cultural capabilities had developed in ways that required adjustment for subsequent phases. The cultural developments the fourth design had produced were extensive enough to require the next design to incorporate the cultural foundations, while modifying specific cognitive and biological features that would support the technological development the Council had planned for subsequent phases. The fifth design was deployed during the period the framework describes as the proto-technological phase. The Sumerian terminology for the fifth design is rendered as Lu-Gish-Sa, with the literal translation being approximately the building aware ones or the constructing ones. The fifth design demonstrated significant capacity for technological development, with design members producing tools, constructions, and systems that exceeded what previous designs had produced. The fifth design's technological capabilities provided the foundation for subsequent civilizational development at scales that previous designs could not have supported. The fifth design operated for approximately 10,000 years, according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's technological development required additional cognitive features that would support more sophisticated technological development during subsequent phases. The replacement design preserved the technological capabilities while adding cognitive features that would enable the species to develop technologies that the fifth design could not have produced. The sixth design was deployed during the period the framework describes as the early modern phase. The Sumerian terminology for the sixth design is rendered as Lu-Bar-Sa, with the literal translation being approximately the discerning aware ones or the analytical ones. The sixth design demonstrated capacity for systematic analysis, mathematical reasoning, and the development of frameworks for understanding natural phenomena through observation and inference. The sixth design produced the cognitive foundations for what the framework would identify as proto-scientific development, with the design's analytical capabilities representing significant refinement over previous designs. The sixth design operated for approximately 8,000 years, according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design's analytical capabilities required additional features that would support broader integration of cognitive functions during subsequent phases. The replacement design preserved the analytical foundations, while adding integration capabilities that would enable more comprehensive cognitive operation. The seventh design was deployed during the period the framework describes as the integrated phase. The Sumerian terminology for the seventh design is rendered as Lu Kinsa, with the literal translation being approximately the working aware ones or the operational ones. The seventh design represented the most refined design before the current human species, with members demonstrating capabilities across multiple cognitive domains and the kind of integrated cognitive function that would prepare the developmental sequence for the current iteration. The seventh design's capabilities approached, but did not match the current species' cognitive characteristics, with specific differences that the framework documents in technical terms. The seventh design operated for approximately 5,000 years according to the framework's timeline. The replacement was authorized when the Council determined that the design had completed its developmental phase and that the current iteration would represent the culmination of the developmental sequence to this point. The replacement involved the deployment of the current human species, which incorporated refinements developed across the entire previous developmental sequence, while introducing additional features that distinguish the current species from all previous designs. I want to be precise about what this evidence does and does not establish. It does not prove that 7 previous biological designs were deployed by the Anunnaki Council across the developmental sequence preceding the current human species, with each design existing for thousands of years and being replaced through Council decision rather than natural extinction. The standard scientific framework explains human evolutionary development through natural processes operating across the documented fossil record without external intervention. The framework on BM 91076 requires acceptance of the broader Anunnaki framework that mainstream archaeology has not engaged with. Black's translation is unpublished and has not been peer-reviewed, but the tablet exists. The translation exists. The mainstream paleoanthropological record documents multiple hominid species that existed before the current human species, with the documented species including Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and other identified populations. The fossil record provides evidence that previous hominid species existed alongside or preceded the current human species, with mainstream interpretation explaining the patterns through natural evolutionary processes. The framework on BM 91076 offers an alternative interpretation in which the documented previous hominid species correspond to specific designs in the developmental sequence the framework identifies, with the natural evolutionary explanation being incomplete and the Council intervention being the actual cause of the documented transitions. The convergence between the framework and the paleoanthropological record is significant in specific respects. The number of identified previous hominid species that mainstream paleoanthropology has documented falls within a range that could correspond to the 7 previous designs the framework identifies, with the specific correspondences requiring additional research to establish. The pattern of replacement between species, with earlier species being succeeded by later species across the developmental timeline, matches what the framework would predict for the Council's sequential design approach. The cognitive and physical differences between successive species documented in the fossil record correspond to the kinds of developmental progressions the framework identifies in its descriptions of each design's characteristics. The Denisovan population provides a particularly relevant example. The Denisovans were identified through genetic analysis of remains from Denisova Cave in Siberia, with the species being recognized as a distinct hominid population that interbred with both Neanderthals and the current human species. The genetic evidence indicates that Denisovan ancestry persists in contemporary human populations in specific regions, particularly in Melanesian and indigenous Australian populations. The framework on BM 91076 would treat the Denisovan population as one of the previous designs the tablet documents, with the genetic continuity between the Denisovans and contemporary humans, representing the kind of designed integration the framework attributes to the Council's developmental approach, rather than the kind of accidental interbreeding that mainstream interpretation has identified. The Neanderthal population provides additional context for the framework's claims. The Neanderthals existed across Europe and Western Asia for approximately several 100,000 years before disappearing from the fossil record approximately 40,000 years ago. The mainstream interpretation explains the Neanderthal disappearance through competition with modern humans, climate factors, and interbreeding that absorbed the Neanderthal genetic contribution into the broader human population. The framework on BM 91076 would treat the Neanderthal population as one of the previous designs, with the disappearance representing the kind of designed replacement the framework documents for each transition in the developmental sequence. The Homo floresiensis population, identified through remains discovered on Flores Island in Indonesia in 2003, provides another example that the framework would integrate into its identification of previous designs. The species, sometimes called the Hobbit species due to its small stature, existed on Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago. The mainstream interpretation has approached the species' relationship to other hominid populations cautiously, with debates continuing about whether the species represents a distinct evolutionary branch or an isolated population that developed specific characteristics through island dwarfism. The framework would treat Homo floresiensis as representing a specific previous design, or a regional variant of one of the previous designs in the sequence. The Homo naledi population, identified through remains discovered in the Rising Star cave system in South Africa in 2013, provides additional documentation of previously unrecognized hominid species. The species has been dated to approximately 300,000 years ago, placing it within the period when modern humans had also begun to appear. The discovery of Homo naledi has produced ongoing debate about the relationship between the species and the broader hominid family tree, with the species' characteristics combining features that mainstream paleoanthropology had previously associated with distinct evolutionary periods. The framework would treat Homo naledi as additional evidence of the multiple previous designs the tablet documents. The closing passage of the tablet, in Black's translation, addresses contemporary readers directly. The Sumerian scribes wrote, "Those who read this as members of the 8th design should understand that the developmental sequence we have documented is the actual history of your species. The previous 7 designs preceded you. Each design served specific developmental purposes during its operational period. Each design was replaced when the Council determined that further development required modifications the existing design could not support. You are the most refined design produced to date. You are not necessarily the final design. The developmental sequence will continue, with additional designs being deployed if the Council determines that further refinement is required. The patterns of replacement we have documented for the previous 7 designs provide the framework for understanding what would constitute the conditions under which the current design might be replaced by a subsequent design in the sequence. You are not necessarily the final design. The framing positions the current human species within a broader developmental sequence that may continue beyond the current iteration. The framework does not predict imminent replacement of the current species. It identifies the conditions under which previous replacements occurred and indicates that the developmental sequence remains an active framework rather than a completed history. The current species exists within an ongoing developmental project, rather than at the endpoint of a completed sequence. The institutional response to BM 91076 has been silence. The Mesopotamian developmental corpus has been the subject of limited scholarly analysis, with most attention focused on more accessible historical and literary materials rather than on foundational biological frameworks. The framework on BM 91076 specifically has not been integrated into the standard discussion of Sumerian developmental thought or contemporary paleoanthropology. Black's translation has not been published. The tablet sits in London alongside the other Sumerian documents whose implications mainstream institutions have chosen not to engage with. I am not telling you that the Anunnaki Council deployed 7 previous biological designs across the developmental sequence preceding the current human species, with each design existing for thousands of years and being systematically replaced through Council decision until the current species was deployed as the 8th iteration. I am telling you that a Sumerian tablet, preserved in the format used for formal developmental documentation, describes such a sequence in specific terms, identifies each of the 7 previous designs with specific characteristics and operational periods, documents the replacement procedures applied to each previous design, and identifies the current human species as the 8th iteration in the ongoing developmental sequence. The conventional explanations may be correct, the Sumerian framework may be correct, or both may be partially correct. The tablet sits in London. The translation sits in the museum archive. The paleoanthropological record continues to document previous hominid species through ongoing fossil and genetic research. The convergences between the framework and the documented record are sufficient to warrant attention, even when the specific claims cannot be definitively verified. That is the story of the Sumerian tablet that names what replaced the first 7 modified species. The first design was the collective aware ones, operating for approximately 20,000 years before being replaced when individual cognition became necessary. The second design introduced individual identity, but was replaced when physical capabilities required reduction. The third design refined social organization, but required cognitive expansion. The fourth design produced cultural foundations, but required technological development. The fifth design enabled proto-technological capability, but required analytical refinement. The sixth design provided analytical foundations, but required cognitive integration. The seventh design represented integrated cognitive function, but required further refinement that produced the current 8th design. We are the 8th in the sequence. The framework documents the conditions under which further replacements would occur. The sequence remains active. The 8th iteration continues. The framework provides what the Sumerians considered essential context for the species to understand its own developmental position. If you want more, subscribe now. Next week I am covering the Sumerian tablet that describes the specific archaeological locations where evidence from each of the 7 previous designs may still be preserved, the methods that could potentially be used to investigate the evidence, and what the Sumerians preserved about the broader patterns that would distinguish the 8th design from its potential successor if the developmental sequence continues into a 9th iteration. The video is on screen now. Click it.